Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Intertek CEA's webinar covering the Section 232 investigation into polysilicon and the resulting tariffs and investigation. We will be going through a number of policy and market updates on that policy today. We do have a disclaimer. We'd invite you to read that at your discretion. For those of you that do not know CEA, we have a long history providing PV, battery storage, and other renewable energy equipment quality assurance and other services. We primarily focus on the PV module side, the battery energy storage side, as well as tracking rackers, inverters, transformers, and other balance of system equipment. We provide a wide range of services spanning from supply chain management support all the way up to ESG and traceability audits. And please feel free to get into contact with myself, Christian, my co-presenter, or anyone else at the conclusion of this call if you would like to know more about Intertek CEA. But we're going to delve right into the main focus of today's call, which is the Section 232. The first portion of this presentation will be covered by my colleague, Christian Roselund, the head of policy research at Intertek CEA, to give you an overview of the policy, what we know, what are still some lingering uncertainties, and answer a couple clarifying questions that we see asked quite often within the industry. I myself, Joseph Johnson, will come back in during the market implication side to describe how we see the current reaction from the manufacturer's perspective, what we expect to happen in the long term, and what are some of the kind of near-term options for developers and for procurement personnel. There is a Q&A feature as part of the GoToWebinar application. We will be asking and answering questions during the middle and then at the final Q&A, so please submit questions as they come up, and we will answer them again throughout the course of today's presentation. You will have some email addresses that are shown on screen at the conclusion of this call if you would like a copy of the presentation materials or would like to get into contact with either myself or Christian. You will see those emails at the conclusion of the call. And with that, Christian, I'm going to turn it over to you to go through the policy impacts first.
Thank you so much, Joseph. So lots to talk about today. While this is a single policy, there are a lot of details and a lot of complexities to it, as well as a number of unknowns. So first I'm going to go over the minimum import price and then talk a little bit about tariff and duty interactions. So let's go to the next slide. Joseph, can we move forward on the slide? Thank you. Okay. So, as you may know, on August 6th, this policy came down, which involves the minimum import price and a 15% tariff. And in case you were wondering, is that an or an and? It's an and. It's both of these are applied to imports. And how this works is that new imports entering into the United States on or after December 4th, 2026 have to be priced at this minimum import price, which is 3.7 cents. Well, there's a dollar per kilogram price for poly and wafers that we have translated to around 3.7 cents a watt for poly and around 12 cents a watt for wafers, as well as a minimum import price of 22 cents a watt for cells and 38 cents a watt for modules. In addition to that, you need to pay a 15% tariff on the entered price. Now, if you have a contract that was prior to this proclamation, prior to August 6th, 2026, then you import product at that price and you pay a tariff on the difference between that price and the minimum import price, again, if the product comes in on or after December 4th. Then you pay the 15% tariff on that declared value, which will be less than 38 cents. So say, for instance, you brought in your product at 26 cents because that's what your pre-August 6th contract was. Then you'd pay an additional 12 cents of tariff and you'd pay the 15 cents or the 15% tariff based upon that 26 cent per watt module. Notably, we've stacked all of this up to show how these tariffs stack. Also, cells and modules currently are subject to a 10 to 12.5%, depending on the country, Section 301 forced labor tariff. There are some African countries that are not subject to this, but most countries are. So that would be an additional tariff as well that would again be assessed based on the declared value. We've shown how this would stack up. The truth is, in many cases, and particularly as the industry starts to digest this policy, we believe that those tariffs will be borne by the suppliers because the suppliers will be guaranteed a healthy margin due to the minimum import price. So what's the big picture here? What's this going to do to the market? And Joseph will get into this in greater detail, but this has already shown up as a significant increase in US module prices. We also see this basically making imported modules no longer really make any economic sense. So we're expecting domestic module assembly to start to dominate the market in 2027. For cell makers, domestic cell makers to also raise their prices because they can, which combined with the higher imported cell prices, they're going to hit the profitability of module-only companies. But frankly, companies that make cells in the United States will also have their profitability hit because they'll be importing wafers at 12 cents a watt. Really, the big exception to all of this is vertically integrated companies. Vertically integrated companies can afford to sell at these inflated minimum import prices and pocket the margin on, say, if you're a company that makes cells and modules and you make cells overseas, you sell in at 22 cents a watt, you can have your modules produced at a lower cost because you've made the profit on the cell side. And the higher the degree of vertical integration, the more benefit this has. Wafers coming into this country aren't cheap either under the minimum import price. Next slide. Joseph, can we move forward? Oh, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of how all of this works. So obviously, anything that comes in December 3rd or prior is not subject to these rules. Starting on December 4th, you have a question before you. Is your import of polysilicons, ingot, wafer, cells, or modules declared at or above the price of the minimum import price? If it is, then you still need to provide documentation to customs that shows that the first arm's length sale in the United States occurs at or above the minimum import price. Arm's length sale, by the way, is an interesting subject legally. It's clear that in some cases in the past, sales between related entities, if they are sold at what is considered a fair price, would still be considered arm's length sales. So if you do provide that documentation and you've sold at it above the minimum import price, then you need to still pay the 15% tariff and any other applicable tariffs and duties. And note that tariffs like anti-dumping and countervailing duties stack on top of this. If you don't provide that information to customs, then you need to pay a tariff equal to the minimum import price, plus a 15% tariff, plus any other tariffs and duties. So not providing documentation would result in, for modules, a 38 cent per watt tariff plus 5.7 cents per watt from the 15%. So it's a pretty significant penalty here for not providing documentation. Now, if you have one of those contracts that is prior to the date of this proclamation, and so your declared price is at a lower value, then if you provide documentation of that contract to customs, then you pay 15% of the declared value, all other tariffs and duties on that declared value, and then a specific tariff that's equal to the difference between that contract price and the MIP. Now, if you don't provide that documentation, you're back to the tariff equal to the minimum import price, which is very, very expensive. Next slide. So let's talk about what this means in terms of customs. Customs now suddenly has new powers and new authority over solar imports that, similar to when UFLPA was created, suddenly Customs was tasked with looking into the supply chains of imports that come into this country. Now they are tasked with looking into contracts and prices. So there is this new requirement of importers that with polysilicon 232 and of customs, that customs has to create and implement a certification program whereby it inspects the contracts and the other documentation of sales prices. And that's ultimately to determine conformity with this minimum import price and to assign tariff levels on individual importers based on this documentation. This means also that customs will now be monitoring and enforcing the accuracy of importer documentation. This includes banning importers who are non-compliant with the certification, because if it's found that you fudge the numbers or that you've otherwise not complied with the certification process, there are penalties, and there's also potentially a ban on your company importing polysilicon or any of these other solar products into the United States. Now, as I mentioned, this is a substantial expansion of customs role and authority when it comes to solar, and implementation of these actions, as we saw with UFLPA, even that product that got cleared took time to get cleared. And so this can mean delays on imports. Unfortunately, that's kind of the best case scenario in terms of what it will impact. There's also potential weaponization of this policy against solar imports and against specific importers. So lots of concerns here about how this will actually be implemented under customs. Next slide. And we can move to the next slide. Oh, thank you. So here's the thing, this policy is not static, right? These minimum import prices were set, but the same proclamation that sets these prices also tells the Secretary of Commerce to adjust the levels of the minimum import prices from time to time, so not on any particular set schedule, to account for market conditions and other factors. So these numbers could well change. I don't expect that they'll change soon, but they could change, and they could change on a schedule which is currently entirely unpredictable. Also, one of the things that this proclamation does is tell the Secretary of Commerce to create a program to incentivize investment in the United States, and this includes soliciting and approving companies' plans to onshore factories. Now, the approval of these plans includes that you get an exemption from the minimum import price for the imports of polysilicon and the downstream solar products in the values that are deemed to be necessary for the onshoring. So that's a potential carrot here that's been dangled, or rather the potential removal of a stick. But we'll see how this works in practice. This is relatively new territory here. We have seen something similar happen with the FCC router ban, where routers that were, there was basically a blanket ban on imported routers, and then companies could apply for conditional exemptions from the router ban. And many of them did, and many of them were granted those conditional approvals within months, weeks to months. However, no Chinese companies were. And so I think that there's a significant concern here that Chinese companies in particular could get blocked out, and that other companies, non-Chinese companies, are much more likely to be able to get exemptions from the minimum import price through this onshoring plan program. So those are all the changes that are baked into the policy, that are written in as part of the proclamation. We also have the question of what happens when we get a presidential administration. A new administration is likely to modify the details here and could even replace this program with another program. You notice that I say modify or replace. I don't say repeal entirely. And this brings up an interesting point that we've seen, which is what I call policy stickiness. The ITC, when it was first implemented, was reauthorized many times over a course of decades until the final phase out. And right now, the final phase out only for solar and wind, not even for batteries. When we look at, and that, under the OBBB, when we look at the Section 201 tariffs on solar, the Section 301 tariffs on China, the Section 232 on steel and aluminum, all of those were initially put in place during the first Trump administration, and the Biden administration didn't remove those tariffs. They may have modified them. They may have changed them. In some cases, they even made them more severe, in some cases less severe, but they kept all of those tariff programs. And that's the thing, is that once a policy like this gets put into place, industry adapts. Business plans are changed to take into account this new policy and the conditions created by this new policy, and that creates a constituency that doesn't want, that doesn't necessarily want these policies to go away, because their business plans are based upon the existence of these policies. So, we'll see what happens. Even right now we have a Republican president. Even if a Democratic president is elected in 2028 and takes office in 2029, we might still have, if not this program, something similar. We're likely to have something similar to it. So that's what I have for the broad strokes of how we see this policy working, and what the policy implications are. We're going to take a few questions, and then I'm going to turn over to Joseph to talk more about the market implications.
Perfect. Thanks for that overview, Christian. So the first question that's come up has been, if I'm using US polysilicon, does that get me any exemptions or any exceptions to the minimum import price?
That's what's interesting is when we had the polysilicon 232 comments, we had a number of comments that suggested that you should get a better deal if you use US polysilicon as the raw material in your imports. That never happened. Right now, there's no advantage under the current form of this program for using US polysilicon. If you're importing, well, obviously, if you're an ingot and wafer maker and using US polysilicon, then you're in a better position because you don't pay a tariff because it doesn't cross the border. However, if you're importing wafers, it doesn't really matter where the poly was from. You still have to pay that minimum import price and that 15% tariff.
And so if I renegotiate my contract after August 6th, because maybe my contract had some tariff sharing and we want to nail that down with the supplier, will that be flagged by CBP because there is potentially a sizable change upward in that contract value?
We saw speculation about this on other webinars by people at organizations that had tried very hard to influence this policy. And that's not in the final form of this policy. The policy it says if you have a pre-August 6th contract, you can stick to those contract terms, and you can, present that information to customs and then pay the difference in a tariff. It doesn't say that there's any penalties for changing to the minimum import price, which would frankly be double jeopardy. Because if you're telling people, well, now you need to import at this minimum import price, but you're telling them, oh, don't change your contracts, I'm not sure that would legally hold up. So, based upon the principles of American law and based upon the way that this policy is written, we expect everyone will change their future contract prices to the minimum import price, and we don't see anything that shows any penalty for doing so.
Perfect. And then for those companies that are planning upstream investments in the US to possibly get some of the exemptions or exceptions mentioned in the text of the bill or the act, what type of exemptions or exceptions have been identified or might we expect?
Right. So the one that's been spelled out is you get to import products subject to the MIP without having to pay the MIP or the tariffs, right? So you basically get to bring in your goods at a lower price if you're given this exemption, which is, a notable exemption and would create very much an unlevel playing field for those suppliers that have the approved onshoring plans. Now, that's only supposed to be limited to the amount that you're supposed to need in your U.S. factories. But we'll see how this actually works in practice.
And you noted that if we get a change in administration, we're probably at least not, maybe don't bank on a immediate change to the Section 232. Is there any technical end to the 232 out in the distance, or does this continue forever?
You know, that's the problem with the 232 statute. We saw 232s that were implemented under the first Trump administration, that were continued under the Biden administration, that have been continued under the Trump administration. These things are revisited every 4 years, but that doesn't mean that they go away. So this is the reality that we're going to be dealing with for the foreseeable future.
And one of the more common questions is going through that first arm's length sale legalese, or the definition of that. A lot of customers are still concerned about, okay, if I'm, again, doing US module assembly, do I still potentially pay the 38 cent per watt module minimum import price if there's an imported cell and then module assembly in the US? Or can that US assembled module be under the 38 cent per watt minimum import price?
So yeah, if you're shipping in the cells and the price is 22 cents a watt, which is the minimum import price, I think there's a good argument to be made that that is considered an arm's length transaction, because there is definitely legal precedent that sales between related parties, which, you know, could be your cell subsidiary and your module subsidiary, are considered arm's length if they're done at the price that would otherwise be used in the market. And clearly the price that's otherwise used in the market is set here. For a cell, it's 22 cents a watt. And so that means that's the first arm's length sale of these goods, even if it is an internal sale. And that removes the requirement that the next sale be at the minimum import price. So that's what creates the opportunity to bring in cells at 22 cents a watt, but then have a module that's lower than 38 cents a watt, particularly if we're dealing with these vertically integrated companies where you can make your money on the cell side and you don't need to make your money on the module side.
And then going back to your initial tariff stacking chart, you mentioned it briefly, but there's currently the minimum import price, the 232, section 232, 15% ad valorem tariff applied to that minimum import price. And then there's the additional anywhere from 10 to 12.5% forced labor, section 301, also on top of that. Can you just re-explain the stacking clauses, also bring in the AD/CVD as an example, and talk about, you know, how those stacking mechanisms work? What's the applicable price point or figure that each of those percentage-based tariffs is applied to?
So whenever you're dealing with a tariff or a duty, it applies to the declared value, the value you declared when you imported the goods. So if you have one of those pre-existing contracts and the number is below the minimum import price, that's the basis for all of the tariffs and duties. Now, of course, you'll get hit with the extra specific tariff or the true-up tariff between that cost and the minimum import price, right? In terms of the stacking, it's explicit in the document, and in actually more in Annex 2, that the minimum import price, the 15%, is added. It's additional and it's additive, right? It's also explicit that other tariffs and duties, including AD/CVD, apply. For 301, this one's a bit more nuanced. The thing with 301 right now, there is no exemption. In the forced labor 301, there's a list of import codes that are exempted, and the import codes for polysilicon and ingots and wafers are exempted from the forced labor 301. The code 854142 and 854143, which is for PV cells and PV modules, crystal and silicon, these tariff codes are not exempted from the Section 301. Now, they should be, because what we've been told, including in that tariff proclamation, is that 232s apply to one set of goods, 301s apply to another. If you're subject to a 232, you're not subject to a 301. So those forced labor tariffs shouldn't apply, but as long as there's no exemption from the 301, my read is that they apply. So this is something that the Trump administration could fix, could change in the future, saying, oh, well, these are now subject to a 232. We remove them from the 301s, from the forced labor 301. But that hasn't, as far as I know, that hasn't happened yet.
And then are there any other policy follow-ups that we're expecting to this proclamation that would help clarify things like what is the kind of scope of U.S. manufacturing incentives that might be on offer, or is this what we get?
No, we are expecting additional regulations to come from the Commerce Department implementing all of this, but it's unclear what timeline that will be. And, those could be 3 months out, 4 months out. I think there's going to be a delay until we get those. And, even when I've noted that with these regulations, even when there's a stated timeline, a lot of times these agencies will take longer than that period to issue the regulations. You may recall this from the Treasury regulations implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, that we didn't always get those on the deadline.
Perfect. And we'll take one more, and then we'll save other questions until the end. One, for those incentives that might be applicable for companies that apply for U.S. investments, can you go through what's the scope of that investment? If module makers continue to expand or build new U.S. module capacity, can they qualify and get exempt cells, or is it only for upstream?
So if you read the Trump administration's document that they posted on the White House website that creates this action, they note that these sort of onshoring incentives will be available for polysilicon, ingot wafer, and cell factories, not module factories. So setting up a new, and they don't say not module, but they just don't list module factories. So setting up a new module factory in the United States doesn't necessarily qualify as a valid onshoring plan, and will not necessarily get you any benefit, any freedom from the MIP. It will mean that, if you're trying to sell in the US market, then you'll have to pay a 22-cent MIP instead of a 38, 22 cents on the cell. So it may work anyway, but it doesn't get you an exemption. Module factories don't get you an exemption from the MIP.
Perfect. Well, thanks for that, Christian. We'll have you back on, probably answer more questions within the next 30 minutes, but I'm going to go through an overview of some of the market reactions we've seen thus far and some of the longer term expectations. So getting into that now, ultimately, the price that most manufacturers are starting to offer all starts with a 4. This is going to be an immediate, new issue of a lot of different contracts, a lot of renegotiation that is going on the back of a policy that is not fully clear, as evidenced by some of the questions we were just asking, but to put some pretty big sticker shock around things like imported modules that is expected to make it more difficult for a good portion of overseas module makers that have enjoyed many years of shipping modules to the US and building that track record. It will make those overseas vendors a lot less competitive with at least US module assembly for now. We do expect that these prices we're showing here, these are current manufacturer reactions. These are going to be the spot prices that manufacturers are looking at offering, given there's going to be a number of developers that were still banking on getting imported modules into the country, given the timeline for the 232 was never certain and always seemed to be coming and always seemed to be late. That will now have to switch from an overseas module contract to a new U.S. assembly contract. Those U.S. assembly spot contracts are coming in a little bit lower. Everyone's looking at the overseas pricing to say, okay, how can we increase our margin, but still make sure we're going to get volume in sales? And then for some of the more domestic content-oriented supply chains, those prices haven't changed as much. Yes, at least the U.S. cell, so there's less movement really on kind of the domestic contract, pre-signed contracts, but a lot more movement around new orders from customers that are going from their overseas contracts to more U.S. assembly for their 27 and 2028 pipelines. We do want to stress that these are just some of the current prices being reflected in the market. We don't necessarily expect them to hold long term. The market does typically overreact around a new policy or tariff and then starts to adjust in time as workarounds or strategies for managing some of the tariff burdens are found. As Christian mentioned, there is an opportunity for an imported cell to be made into a module and then resold well under the minimum import price of 38 cents for an imported module. So there is room for competition to develop. I think it's also worthwhile putting this into kind of a broader perspective. The immediate price reaction is taking module imports to about 46 cents per watt if you're stacking the minimum import price plus the 15% ad valorem tariff plus shipping to the US West Coast. That'll just take us back to some of the pricing we saw in 2022 and 2023 as the market was reacting to the anti-circumvention case that was levied against Southeast Asian module producers. We saw a very big market overreaction. Everyone was rushing to get modules into the country in time before the Biden moratorium on those anti-circumvention duties expired. And then since the now start of those anti-circumvention duties, the start of a formal anti-dumping and countervailing duty case against those 4 Southeast Asian nations under Solar 3, the expansion of the AD/CVD to Solar 4 nations, we had seen pricing still not bounce back to those 22 and 23 levels as the market got used to the AD/CVD and the anti-circumvention languages, and manufacturers expanded around those AD/CVD requirements. Now, of course, we are seeing pricing back to that level as an immediate shock to the fact that pricing for products has to come in at a certain rate. But we do expect those prices to go down, as we'll talk about a little bit later on in this presentation. As you start to build more products in the US, there's the opportunity for a much lower cost threshold. And therefore, if you're stacking some additional margin on top, you can still get to pricing that is well under a lot of the 40+ cent per watt offers that are currently going on in the market. Also, we expect some more competition to develop. Right now, as mentioned, about 60% of PV products that come into the US are modules. The other 40% being tracked directly are cells. So that's a split of PV imports that still favors modules today. That is going to shift in time. It is now more favorable just to make modules in the US market directly. And we've already seen a lot of manufacturers start to pivot in that direction. If we're looking at the future build out of module capacity from companies that have already started manufacturing, that are currently ramping, building, constructing facilities, that are importing equipment, that are securing the sites, that already amounts to 100+ gigawatts of US module assembly. Now, we have not seen the follow through from many of those upstream stages. We're not seeing as much cell capacity, as much ingot wafer capacity in polysilicon. We might start to see some more of this in time, but the main way to kind of get around the Section 232 or to deal with the minimum import pricing is to build modules and then continue to import cells. Given all the unknowns that Christian mentioned, it is very difficult to commit to a multi-year, hundreds of $millions of new CapEx spend on a PV facility that could continue to face a lot of policy turmoil. Just within the last couple of weeks, we've seen an FCC inverter ban. We've seen a recent White House proclamation that also starts to look more closely at your other balance of system in your PV plant. With all these challenges to other equipment component areas, it's very difficult for manufacturers to expand in that type of environment when there are so many unknowns about how many projects might still continue to get built out into the future. What is clear, though, is there is going to be a lot of module assembly for developers to take advantage of. And so this will kind of make the case for how prices could come down in the future. These are not prices today. This is going to go into the future to 2031 to look at a period where there's no more domestic content in the market. Manufacturers can still benefit from the 45X manufacturing tax credit, which is included here as an offset to cost at each of these different supply chain nodes for US manufacturing. but it does show that a kind of a market setting cost structure is going to be closer to 30 cents. There are certainly more US supply chains without being subject to some of those higher minimum import price thresholds that can manufacture at a cost under that 30 cents per watt. But since we're really looking at a lot of US module manufacturing and not a lot of those additional upstream segments, the general cost setting structure will be just module assembly with an imported cell. Other supply chains can sell up to that, and the prices are likely to be slightly higher than this because module makers still have to make some money on top of their production. But this does show that a better price floor for the US, or a more reasonable price in time once the market has developed and actually kind of overcome some of the 232, would be much closer to 30 cents rather than the 40 cents that it is currently being offered at. Now, this is going to be a pretty significant deviation from pricing that we were looking at in early 2025, when a lot of modules were still priced in the low 20 cent per watt range. So this will be kind of a net growth of pricing by 10 cents per watt versus, again, end of 24, early 2025 module price lows, but it'll still be 10 cents per watt better than what the market is currently offering. We do expect that buyers will have to be patient for pricing to come down. Manufacturers are again trying to get everyone to sign up under the new pricing regime while pricing and uncertainty is the highest. And then in time, as some of those additional US module facilities come online, that market setting cost structure will start to be closer and closer to the pricing actually shown in the market. Unfortunately, that does take time, and for procurement teams that need to make a decision in the near term, there's unlikely to be many better offers if you don't already have a contract in hand with some negotiation power. The other reason we're not expecting some of those other supply chains to bring pricing down that much below 30 cents right now is just the time, the capital, and the uncertainty required for a new investment in the US. If you're looking at a cell manufacturing plant, that seems to be kind of the most obvious next step. If you have a lot of module, you at least need the cell. What you're going to have there, and actually I think my presentation just dropped for a second, so I'll be bringing that back here in a moment. We should be coming back up. But for a US cell factory, that's going to require several years. And by the time your US cell factory is close to being operational, you're going to face the expiration of the domestic content bonus, which means all of the premium that is currently attributable to a US cell to secure that additional bonus value for a developer does go away. So then you're going to be pricing closer and closer just to US assembly. There's also a technical skill gap in the US. There's concerns around equipment procurement. If you want a lot of equipment very quickly, it generally has to come from China, and that's going to go through either export control risks from China directly. You have to ensure that everything is going to be kosher under foreign entity of control rules. It just adds a lot of risk to getting that equipment, getting monitored equipment very quickly. There's also the type of equipment selection choice that remains, again, very much a question for new companies. There's still IP lawsuit overhangs for TOPCon that are unlikely to get resolved until the end of 2027. There's still a vetting among HJT that has to take place. We haven't seen mass production HJT in many markets outside of China directly, and so it does have to be kind of proven in mass still in the US. And then if you are going to build the safer technology PERC, you are facing obsolescence. If your competitors build a new N-type technology successfully, you're just going to be outclassed by a higher efficiency product. So that all creates a lot of decision overhang for potential investors that would lend capital, as well for manufacturers that would undertake these decisions directly. And if you're looking at ingot, wafer, and polysilicon, a lot of those similar risks still hang in the balance, but they just go doubly for where you're going to get your equipment, and then who's going to come in to help support you ramping that factory and transferring the know-how to get into ingot, wafer, and polysilicon. So we might expect to see some additional cell. There's, at least for very nimble and very quick to act manufacturers, some avenues to getting that cell online relatively quickly to, again, take advantage of domestic content or higher price sell products in the interim. But for many of the other upstream stages, we don't think, or at least right now, the minimum import price is going to be enough to encourage some longer term US investment. Right now, there's enough cells, wafers, and polysilicon outside of China and outside of duty subject nations to continue to serve the US market, especially if there is some additional demand erosion as a result of the culmination of policies that are going on in the PV space right now. And the other reason we're expecting that pricing comes down is, as Christian was pointing out, some of the legalese around an arm's length sale. There is the possibility that offsets are used to keep component pricing more amenable to an end buyer. What we have here is an example of Company A, which is a foreign cell maker. They're in blue at the top, and they're going to be selling a cell to a US module OEM company for that minimum import price of 22 cents plus the tariff and shipping. So that's going to ultimately be a 25 cent per watt cell that lands on US shores. However, that module buyer also has a kind of another contract with that cell provider where they're going to be providing an OEM fee. They're going to be doing the module processing because the overseas cell maker doesn't have a US module factory. And that OEM processing fee for the module tolling can also be very high, such that it offsets a good portion of that a very expensive cell they just bought. A key portion or a key function of the minimum import price is if you're selling at the minimum import price, there is still going to be that 15% Section 232 ad valorem tariff that is applied to your product, but the rest of the pricing up to the minimum import price is accretive margin to your organization. So that still provides a good amount of profitability to keep companies very interested in selling into the US. So that initially 25 cent per watt cell offset by a 9 cent per watt OEM processing fee can effectively be thought of as a cell that's priced at the mid-teens. Add in module cost processing in the US, there's another maybe margin that US OEM is adding in on top, and you get to a module cost that's closer to about 25 cents. And then if that initial cell maker buys back the module, they can add some additional margin on top of that there, and then resell it to an end buyer in the US for 30 cents. There's still a lot of companies on the manufacturing side that are making money and are not going to be disappointed. There's also a module buyer at the end of this that gets a much more affordable module relative to pricing we're seeing today in the 40s. Now, again, I do want to stress that this is not going on. Manufacturers are certainly seeking for additional margin. In the interim, there's not many additional options for buyers. If you have a canceled contract from an overseas vendor, the next best option is, again, US module assembly that is charging very high prices. But in time, for cell makers overseas that want to continue doing business, for module makers in the US that currently aren't getting large-scale sales volumes, this starts to become a strategy to be more price competitive, especially as some of that module capacity continues to develop in the US and we start to see more competitive juices start to flow. So our main recommendation is these prices at 40 cents are unlikely to last forever. They're probably not going to go back to the 20 cents that we saw a year ago, but settling in the middle at something around or north of low 30s is probably going to be the new market reality once manufacturers and buyers start to adjust to these new policies. And so with that, we've seen a number of additional questions come in. So I'm going to have a moment to read through some of them, but I'll invite Christian to come back. And if there's any in the Q&A panel that you've already identified, I'll hand it to you first, and then we can just alternate thereafter.
So yeah, just an interesting question that came in here. Anything to address suppliers parking margins overseas and incurring a loss in the US to price modules lower? Well, not sure if that's an accepted practice, but it's what I expect. I think that this, there are consequences, economic consequences to price fixing. And one of them is this sort of behavior. And certainly there's a prohibition against selling products into the United States below the minimum import price that comes with a tariff. But, you've just forced me to sell my cell in the United States at 22 cents. that's one of the issues with the minimum import price, is it creates a guaranteed profit. And, in the interest of economic efficiency, well, it creates a real opportunity for products to be priced lower in the United States. And there isn't anything in this proclamation. If the first arm's length sale is at the minimum import price, prices from there, and I think this addresses some of the other questions, then the final purchase price in the United States is not determined. Nor would it frankly be realistic for customs to be monitoring all of the sales prices within the United States. Certainly they're supposed to go after those suppliers that are stating one downstream sales price in their documentation and then selling at another. That is prohibited. If you're bringing in your cells, you've got your declared price at 22 cents a watt, but you end up selling them at 15, that's obviously a problem. But if you bring in those cells at 22, the price is 22, and then those are turned into modules later, that's not something that really is addressed by this.
Yeah. And going back to the chart that was showing the kind of great acceleration of US module capacity up to 100 plus gigawatts over a US demand that's currently sized at less than half of that, what are kind of the options for module makers? I want to stress that there's not really an overseas module market for US manufacturers. The US pays the highest price in the world for PV modules and all of its components as a result of all the policy that has been layered into this space. There's no other resale market for US modules. So US module makers either have to start competing on pricing to get additional sales, or they can just downrate their utilization. Module manufacturing generally is overbuilt, so having a decent amount of excess module capacity is always good. As a module maker, you want to be able to respond to seasonality, to rush orders that let you capture maybe higher prices on a desperate customer. So it's always better to have a little bit of extra module supply than not enough module supply and have to go to an OEM if you have a big order you want to fill. But when you start to get to multiples of demand, 2x the amount of US demand as module capacity, that's typically when we start to expect more competitive forces to work.
Yeah, I also noticed a question here, and this is a really interesting tactical question, whether or not it's the contract, the MSA, or the PO that has to be executed prior to August 6th. Well, the language in the proclamation is contract. And this is the sort of thing where when we get further regulations, that there could be some nuance to this, and this could, that definition could change a little. But for right now, it is the contract that has to be executed prior to August 6th for to qualify for bringing in a product below the minimum import price.
On the prior comments on if we think this is ultimately going to encourage more US investment, there certainly will probably be more US module factories. The forecast we were showing has just been what is credibly announced and in the works to date. Those numbers on the module capacity side, the cell capacity side could certainly grow. At this point, with so many other, lack of clarifications to the policy, as Christian mentioned, another administration may tinker with it, if not, even if it is likely to persist. We're probably not going to see the really long lead time investment for something like ingot, wafer, and polysilicon materialize, at least right now. We might start to see a couple companies revisit initial plans. When the IRA was announced, there were a number of polysilicon plants. There were several ingot and wafer factories, and there was a lot more cell that was ultimately announced to try to raise money. We likely have probably passed the window when a financier would be interested in those plans, but certainly cell and module is likely to be stimulated to a certain degree by this new minimum import price.
Right. And just to be clear on another point, there's a question, will the price set by the minimum import price be the required module price if assembled in the United States? No. If the module is the first thing at arm's length sale, then it is the required price. But if the module is made in the United States, no, there isn't. The first arm's length sale has already occurred with the sale of the cell. And, as long as that was an arm's length sale, and then therefore that creates the opportunity for the modules to be domestically made modules to be priced below the minimum import price, which may not be happening now, but we do anticipate as Joseph mentioned, as we get more capacity online.
I'm going to walk back one slide here because there's a number of questions. One, there's a question of, where does this 16 cent per watt cell value come from? That 16 cents is going to be the difference from the cell price that the module OEM has paid to the cell maker. This 25 cents per watt over here. It makes it very difficult to highlight that 25 cents on the right-hand side, minus the offset that the cell maker is paying back to the module company to do the module OEMing, the basically module tolling agreement for company A, the cell supplier. So the 25 cents of the cell price minus that processing fee, which is kind of a eventual discount that is passed to a buyer, that's where you get the 16 cents of cell value. You are going to have module cost in there. After the 45X, that module cost, once the cell's in country, is going to be that 7 cents per watt in the middle, forecasted out as different component prices come down. We're assuming that the module OEM, that tolling provider, is only going to get about 2 cents of the margin. They're not providing the cell. They're just going through the process of assembling the module. They're trying to get as much money as they can just on the volume of OEM work they're doing. So it's a small margin, but at a, hopefully for them, larger volume. That's going to ultimately result in a 25 cent per watt module that the company B, the module OEM, sells back to company A. The cell provider, the brand name that is ultimately going to be provided to a developer or to a buyer. And then that cell maker, company A, that's repurchased the module, they're going to add another 5 cents per watt of markup. So the end price will be about 5 cents. But at each stage of this, the cell maker's gotten the very good premium for their cell. That does not cost 25 cents per watt to make. They've also got some module markup for their US entity that is organizing all the OEM transactions. That OEM is making some money just providing the module assembly. And then the end buyer does not pay 40 cents, but they pay something closer to 30 cents. Again, this is a scenario for how you comply with the MIP, how manufacturers can go through arm's length transactions. Everyone still makes money. And at the end of the day, the module price comes down quite a bit.
So there was another question here about applicable tariffs and duties. And we had stated that Section 301 is stacks if applicable. And the reason for that caveat is that currently there is no exemption to the Section 301 forced labor tariffs for PV cells and modules. Those import codes were not included in the exemptions. Now, we think it's likely that this will change because the way that the Trump administration has set up the 232s and the 301s is that you're not supposed to be paying tariffs, both 232 and 301 tariffs. It's supposed to be an either or. And for most goods, it is. So, we expect that that's a loophole that will get fixed and that it is likely that in future 301s, that PV cells and modules are also exempted from those by being nature of being subject to the Section 232.
There's some language in the Section 232 tariff around prohibiting or having recourse against companies engaging in stockpiling. What are our thoughts around that? Christian, I'll give you a chance to respond. But ultimately, for module imports, there's not really enough time to get a significant volume of new modules into the US if they're ordered today. There's lead times for the module equipment overseas, lead times for the cells that have to be processed, time on the water getting from Africa, Southeast Asia to the US, clearing customs. That makes a module purchase very risky at this point in time, unless you had already had your module order in the queue and is just luckily getting fulfilled before December. So unlikely that we're seeing a lot of modules come to the country. Cells, on the other hand, could be something that you stockpile. There's the ability to air freight that in economically. You can store cells for up to a year, generally without voiding those cell warranties from the provider. And the companies that are currently online that would likely ship the most cells, they are probably still going to try to sell as many cells as they can. Yes, there might be some recourse against them, but a lot of the operational cell makers They're going to be providing cells to different entities already. So there's probably not going to be a single entity that's responsible or attributable to a massive amount of cells. It'll just be kind of a general industry increase. And the cell makers that currently do have the volume to really add a lot of stockpile in the US, they are probably going to be impacted by future AD/CVDs. AD/CVDs aren't going away, and AD/CVDs will still provide another meaningful concern to buyers because those cases are likely to continue. And so the biggest cell exporters today, whether they get hit by kind of a additional penalty for sending a lot of product, either way, they may not be operational in a year or two due to an AD/CVD anyway. So that's probably a risk we would see the cell makers take. And then for the cell makers, there's probably not enough operational capacity in mass production today. There's only a couple cell factories that are either fully operational or ramping up, that the volume of wafers coming in is also probably not going to be large enough to really trigger stockpiling concerns. But I don't know, Christian, if you have any thoughts on that one.
Then the other question becomes, how do you enforce the anti-stockpiling measure, right? Certainly, customs could identify those importers that have brought in large volumes. And this does give them powers to act on those importers, including preventing future imports. It does sound to me a bit like closing the barn door after the horse has left, because by the time they have determined that there are, particularly large volumes being brought in, it's likely that we will have hit December 4th. And, so there could be some retroactive actions here against importers, but it will probably focus on the largest and most egregious stockpilers.
It's also worthwhile stressing that all the other policy concerns that are current in the U.S. market are still active. Foreign entity of concern, where your cell comes from, where your wafer comes from, duties, the expansion of anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases. These are also all mechanisms that will continue to be impactful. We have seen on the cell maker side continued expansion across Africa, new expansion into Central Asia. Cell makers want to stay ahead of the AD/CVD game, and the Section 232 doesn't shut off cells completely from the U.S. In fact, U.S. module assembly and imported cells are now going to be the largely de facto supply chain for the U.S. market. FIOC as well. We've seen a number of companies come through with audits that we've completed or their own certifications that they are compliant. Companies have reorganized their organizational structures where needed to be compliant with those policies. So companies do adapt because there's real opportunity in serving the U.S. market. It's still, the opportunity to even sell at 40 cents in the U.S. would be something that most other manufacturers in other markets would just dream of, given the global average price is 10 to 12 cents per watt for a similar TOPCon panel, whereas again, the US has typically always paid 20 cents or more. So again, companies are not abandoning the US market, but they do have to comply with all the hoops and hurdles the US government is putting in place.
So I saw another interesting question here about risk of challenges through the Supreme Court around the expansion of power at commerce. So this, in terms of the tariffs, the president absolutely does have the right to impose tariffs under Section 232. And the minimum import price is an interesting mechanism. It is likely allowed through the powers of regulating commerce that are allowed under 232 as well. So even though commerce is being asked to do more things, these are things that it's being asked to do to comply with a set of orders where the president clearly does have these powers to implement these programs through Section 232.
I'll note, just because we have about a minute left, if you would like to get into contact with Christian or myself, please take a quick screenshot of our emails here. You can also go through and make a request at just the Intertek CEA website for any further inquiry. There are a number of questions we're just probably not going to be able to get to in the interest of time. But maybe one quick last one as our timer counts down is, if the Section 301 overlap does get fixed, does that change anything? And the answer is probably not. It does provide more meaningful relief that'll get passed to buyers in time. There's already a number of countries that are not subject to the forced labor 301. The better thing would just be clarification around how future 301s would be treated, and that continued exemption for products that are subject to 232s like PV cells and modules. So with that, thanks everyone for attending. Again, apologies if we were just not able to get to your question in time. We look forward to hearing any of those questions after the fact, though, if you do reach out to us. And with that, thank you guys. Have a great rest of your mornings, evenings, or afternoons, wherever this webinar finds you. Christian, any last words?
No, thank you so much.